Hello, y'all, and welcome back. Another cold one in San Antonio. So in this module and in the next module, I'm going to be discussing the person who I contend invents ethics, namely Socrates. Now, I realize that this is a pretty bold and even provocative claim that this vast and universal discipline has an inventor and that it's this one guy. But I'm actually going to double down on that claim and claim that Socrates not only invents ethics, he also invents ethics' parent discipline of philosophy. So Socrates, to give just a little bit of historical context, is a Greek. He is born, lives, and dies in Athens. His dates are 469 to 399 BC. That historical context is really important, and we're going to return to it at some length later on, but we have to take some time now to define a few terms. So I claim that Socrates invents philosophy, and it's worth giving a brief characterization of what philosophy is, both because it is ethics' parent discipline and we're studying ethics, but also because philosophy as a term is going to feature very heavily in what Socrates' own description of what he himself is doing. So philosophy etymologically is philo, love, and sophia, wisdom. So it's the love of wisdom. This is really vague and general, but there's a reason for that, which is that philosophy for a really long time, like more than 1,000 years, referred to really all areas of academic inquiry. Anything sort of not strictly practical was philosophy. And only relatively recently has the scope of that term narrowed to cover the kinds of topics that we think of now as philosophical topics. But even today, the terminal degree in many fields is a PhD, which is short for Latin Philosophiae Doctor, or Doctor of Philosophy. And of course, this is the title of the degree, even if the degree has nothing at all to do with philosophy. Nowadays, though, philosophy is narrower in scope, and while there are many ways to define or characterize it, I like to define or characterize it as thinking clearly about big questions. So by big questions, I mean questions that apply to all human beings, regardless of what time period they're in, or what part of the world, age, race, sex, religion, socioeconomic status, whatever. Questions like God's existence, the nature of the human person, are we physical or non-physical, do we have free will? These might not interest everyone, but unlike certain questions about how to play a sport or an instrument or cook a certain food, they're not unique to one kind or type of person. They apply sort of equally to all of us. Now, let's return to Socrates. Socrates, I contend, invents ethics, and he invents philosophy as a discipline. So for Socrates, philosophy is ethics. So there are no relevant or interesting philosophical questions for Socrates outside of ethical questions. Now, when I say that Socrates invents philosophy, which again for him is ethics, I do not mean that he is the first person to love wisdom, or the first person to ask or think deeply or clearly about big questions. And I certainly don't mean that he's the first person to ask about what a good person is and how to become one. We said, last module or set of lectures that was kind of the primary goal of ethics. What I do mean, though, is that Socrates is the first person historically to use the noun philosophy with a fixed and specific meaning, and he's the first person to use the verb philosophize, so philosophizdein in Greek, to refer not just to the specific study of a few questions or a sub-area of knowledge, but actually to a very specific method. So for Socrates, to do philosophy doesn't mean to talk or think about a set of topics. It involves actually following some very clear steps and following them in order, and most importantly, following them with a very clear goal. Okay? So what is ethics or philosophy for Socrates? For Socrates, ethics, and this is not a direct quote, but we can get this definition really clearly from what he says. Ethics is systematic inquiry with the goal of being a good person. Systematic inquiry with the goal of being a good person. So for Socrates, all philosophy is ethics, and ethics exists solely for the purpose of becoming a good person. So this is what Socrates refers to when he uses the word philosophy as a noun. The specific method he has in mind when he uses philosophize as a verb we'll get to in a minute. But we need to pause here and make note of one really important thing. So recall that I said that Socrates invents philosophy because he's the first person to use philosophy in a fixed and specific meaning. Now, there are people before Socrates who do roughly what we would consider philosophy, so systematic inquiry and kind of the nature the fundamental nature and origin of the universe. We call these people the pre-Socratics. But they themselves notably do not use the word philosophy or philosophize to describe their project, and for good reason, because their goal is not to inquire into one specific set of questions, but really to have knowledge about almost everything. Similarly, or kind of analogously, in Socrates' day, philosophy is used, but it's used to refer to sort of any hand-wavy and theoretical discipline that doesn't make a house or a boot or train a horse or have any sort of immediate tangible or financial payout, right? So anything that's kind of abstract and therefore practically useless. Now, curiously enough, this is also kind of the way that philosophy as a term is used in popular discourse today. Now, of course, I don't think that is at all true. Philosophy does, it's true, have some broad and general questions on which there's, not consensus, on which there's disagreement. But what else has broad and general questions on which there is no consensus? Literally every other discipline. Every discipline that human beings study has areas in it where people don't disagree, where there's no consensus. And that doesn't mean that those disciplines are subjective. It doesn't even suggest that. But I digress. The general point is that then, as now, philosophy refers primarily, or is used to refer primarily to an inquiry where you're seeking knowledge just for the sake of knowledge, right? So not any further goal, not any practical payout of any kind, but just because it's good in some way to have this knowledge for its own sake. So purely theoretical or abstract knowledge. Now, whether this is a fair conception of philosophy, whether this is what philosophy is actually doing, whether this is what philosophy should be doing, are fair questions. But regardless of how you answer those questions, it is vital to note that Socrates, the founder and inventor of philosophy, this discipline, has zero interest in purely theoretical knowledge. So Socrates has no interest at all in knowledge just for the sake of knowledge, none whatsoever. So for him, ethics is not applicable to everyday life or relevant to daily life or whatever. He goes way further than that. For Socrates, the entire and exclusive point of any ethical inquiry, whatever, is the practical goal of being a good person. Anything that does not serve that practical purpose, any inquiry or bit of knowledge, no matter how fascinating it might be on its own, is useless and thus completely uninteresting. Socrates, no doubt, has read about topics like the gods or the fundamental nature of reality, but he never inquires about them. He gives them 0% of his time, and whenever they come up, this is almost kind of comical, he goes out of his way to show, or articulate rather, how little he cares about them. If a question does not directly lead to the end of helping you be a good person, it is useless and of no interest to him. For Socrates, all ethics is applied ethics. Ironically then, the founder of philosophy takes a view of philosophy that is directly at odds with the view of philosophy that is taken by most people today, including many philosophers. So the end and goal of ethics for Socrates is to make people better morally. And how does he employ philosophy to get there? We are going to see that in the coming videos. Thanks.